Colin and I are going to give you an introduction to the Malawi Farm Input Supply Scheme. This is one of the most interesting and most debated policies that we've seen across Africa, widely publicised. And I'm going to give you the sort of technical side of it, and from time to time, Colin is going to jump up to explain the political dimensions of this particular scheme. So, to start off, here is the sort of background to this. Now, if any of you have absorbed those ideas about windows of opportunity, one of the elements of a window of opportunity is a definition of a problem and a widespread shared sense of a problem. And what we're going to look at here is we're looking at maize production in Malawi. We're looking at production and yield from 1990 through to the mid-2000s, yeah? So we're starting off there in 1990 with just under 2 million tonnes. And here we go. This is what it looks like. Of course, you see that big gap there. That's an El Nino year, which is what we're heading for at the moment, those dreadful years of the early 1990s. And then you see the production going up, and then you see it stagnating. So you could say that, you know, through the 1990s, apart from the drought years, you got an increase in production. This is the yield level here, apart from the drought years going up. But then you come into the 2000s here, and you come into the 2000s, and it's very clear we've got stagnating production of maize. We've got several years in which Malawi has to bring in very rapidly maize imports. So there is a sense of national crisis. And this, by the way, of course, is total production. And you have to remember that Malawi's population has been increasing rather rapidly at 3% per annum or more over this period, so the per capita production was really stagnating. So, real sense of crisis by the mid-1990s over maize production. This is looking at another dimension of the perceived problem, which was the volatility of prices. This is looking from 1994 to 2008. And all I want you to see in here, these are maize prices for a series of different points inside of Malawi. But the point to see from this slide is simply that maize prices were extremely volatile, very responsive to seasonal variations in availability of maize, very responsive to variations from harvest to harvest. So this is the technical and economic case for the Malawi Farm Input Supply Scheme. The simple argument was that hybrid maize exists, the technology is there, and that if you use the hybrid maize with the fertiliser, you can go from yields of just over 1 tonne per hectare to 2, 3, 4, 5 tonnes per hectare. So, very simple argument that yields were nowhere near their potential, and you had to take advantage of the technology that was there. The second element that was in there was that fertiliser was costly in Malawi, in large part because the cost of getting fertiliser from the ports of the Indian Ocean, from Beira or Nacala, as landed costs inside of Malawi were very high indeed. You're probably talking about at least $100 per tonne, perhaps $200 per tonne, and that was making fertiliser very costly. There was a big argument about a poverty trap, and this was particularly expounded by Professor Jeffrey Sachs, who said, look at what's happening in Malawi, it's a total tragedy. We have the technology here to defeat hunger in the seeds and so on, but the farmers are so poor, there's no credit, the inputs are expensive, people cannot work their way out of poverty, they're trapped in poverty, and because they can't raise their yields, they never get out of poverty, and because of their poverty, they can't adopt the inputs and so on. So, a very strong argument that a poverty trap was at work here. And for economists, this particular argument I found very attractive. When in 2004-2005 Malawi had to import tens of thousands of tons of maize, some of it coming in as food aid, then the cost of getting it to distribution centres in Malawi were coming in at round about $400 a tonne. Now this is at a time when the world maize price was not much more than $150 a tonne, yeah? Just enormous logistical costs driving up the cost of imported maize in Malawi. And yet, anybody who knew any agricultural economics and had a bit of agronomic information, on the back of an envelope, you could see that the marginal cost of production inside of Malawi was well below $100 a tonne. It simply made no economic sense to bring in the additional tonne of maize from overseas or even bring it from South Africa if you could grow that on the fields of Malawi, which of course you can in any year that isn't a drought year. So a very strong technical and economic case that says we have to do something to raise Malawi's yields. Now, is this the point where you explain the political dimension of it? That's the technocrat story.
Okay, let's think about the politics now. So in May 2004, there was an election in Malawi, and the outgoing president, President Malusi, had tried to change the constitution in order to stand for a third term, and he'd been defeated in his attempts to do that. And so the candidate for his party, the UDF, was Mbingu wa Mutharika, who was not a particularly well-known figure in Malawi at that point. It's now widely understood that President Malusi had appointed him to be his sort of puppet. So Malusi couldn't continue in power, but Mutharika didn't have his own power base, so he would do what Malusi wanted. So Mutharika campaigned. It was not a great campaign. He won a marginal victory. He actually only got 36% of the popular vote. Okay, but it's not a 50% plus one system, so he marginally got through in the first past the post system with the lowest ever proportion of votes for a winning candidate. During the election, because of the trends that Steve has showed you, and particularly there had been a drought and a hunger crisis in 2001-2, but there had been that recent declining trend in fertiliser. There was both main parties campaigned for some form of fertiliser subsidy. They had slight variants on exactly what it was going to look like, but it was something that both parties had campaigned on. Now, when Mutharika got into power, he wasn't interested in being the puppet of Malusi, and by early 2005, the two had fallen out. And so Mutharika I don't know if he got kicked out or left to form his own party, the DPP, the Democratic Progressive Party. But he was now a president with no MPs, and people said, well, you didn't have a mandate because you weren't standing on a DPP ticket when you campaigned to be president. So there was a push to say that he should stand down and contest another election, and he was not interested in doing that. He wanted to stay where he was. He had problems getting things like his budget passed through Parliament. He got 6 MPs through a by-election at the end of his first year, but he still had to rely on the previous opposition for any support. And so his big idea was, let me bring in this fertiliser subsidy, which we had talked about. I'm going to do it the model that the opposition were proposing, so that they like it, so that they will support me in it. But fundamentally, it's a way of me appealing straight over the heads of the Parliament and everyone else, direct to the population, to establish my legitimacy, to say it's all right for me still to be in power even though I'm now in a different party from what I campaigned on, and also to give me some sort of basis on fighting the next election in 2009, because he had no established party machinery, he had no MPs to be doing the work for him, so it was an appeal directly over the heads of the political establishment, direct to the people. That explains what Steve's going to show next, which is that it is a far more broad-based subsidy than most of the others that have come in Africa, and also something that's not on the slides, which is that actually the detailed design of it was what the opposition had proposed rather than what he proposed as UDF candidate.
Thank you, Colin. So this is the programme that was designed, and it had these elements in it. Now, it wasn't a universal subsidy and it wasn't an unlimited subsidy. It was targeted to smallholders. If you're a large farmer, you weren't meant to get it. And it was limited to a couple of bags of fertiliser and a bag of seed, and you were paying at the initial point roughly between a quarter and a third of the real cost. So it was designed to be broad-based and to be targeted towards people who genuinely were facing problems of affordability. By 2006-2007, the rollout of this is really quite remarkable. Vouchers were issued that allowed people to purchase at the subsidised price these limited amounts of fertiliser and seed. And you can see that within a year and a half, 3 million of these vouchers for fertiliser, 2 million for seed. And I think I've got an update of that, 08, 09 there. It was reaching 1.5 million households, roughly 2/3 of all smallholders in Malawi. I mean, when I look at this now, you know, looking back in time, one thing you do say about this is that this is an administrative tour de force, yes? This is not some little pilot project or anything. They genuinely did get it rolled out across pretty much all of Malawi. And the more you look at those things, you say they're quite remarkable achievements. Now, what effects did it have? Well, here is one way of looking at the effects. Let's check what happened to the harvests. And we're looking here from, 2001 to 02, coming through to 12-13, and we're going to be looking at production and yields. So here we go. This is the stagnant period coming into the fertiliser subsidy. And here we go with the fertiliser subsidy years, yes? So suddenly we've gone from a nation that's struggling to reach, that should say, 2.5 million tonnes of maize a year, to a country which is hitting 3.5–4 million tonnes of maize a year. Or at least this is what the reported statistics say. And if we're looking at the yields, well, you can see before that you've got yields round about here, you know, round about 1 to 1.25 tonnes per hectare. And as we go into this area, we're at somewhere between 2 and 2.5 tonnes per hectare. So these were the statistics that people looked at and said, oh my goodness, when you say no to the World Bank, when you say boo to the IMF, when you argue with some of the donors, this is what happens, yes? And this is the message that no doubt, I imagine many of you in the room have seen this message, yes? Go for it, make sure the state gets the smallholders the inputs it needs, and look at what can be done. So that's the good version. There's a little bit more that has come out of some of the evaluations. Evaluations showing more maize available at village level. We've got evaluations that suggest that rural wages have gone up under the impact of higher production with more people hired and so on. And that's tremendously important for the very poorest groups who are on the Ganyu labour, people who are virtually landless in Malawi, desperately dependent on rural wage work. And to see rural wages going up is really terrific. And we've got evidence of reduced rural poverty, and we've got evidence of improved child nutrition. So a lot of things seem to correlate with the fertiliser subsidy. I'm stammering because I'm just thinking, is this a moment that Colin comes in? It is.
One of the things that's, as Steve has already pointed out, is how broad-based this subsidy program is. Steve showed you told you the figure that up to 2/3 of rural households received something in 2008-9. We should note that that was the year of the next election and was the year of maximum coverage. Okay, but let's compare a program in Zambia, also called VISP, without the I, which is going at the same time. Now this is 2010-11. I'm going to show you the 2010-11 figures for Malawi. What you find here, if I can understand Steve's chart well, is that this is the share of farmers in different size categories who receive subsidy vouchers under the Zambian program. So if you're in the 10 to 20 hectare block, you are...
This is the line, not the column.
That's the line, is it?
Yeah.
You have about a 55% chance of getting fertiliser vouchers and almost a 60% chance if you're in the 5 to 10 hectare category. If you go down into the less than 1 hectare category of farmers, you've got about a 10% chance of getting a subsidy. And of course, the vast majority of farmers in Zambia are in those two categories. Okay? So what you have in the Zambia program is 85% of households get nothing, 15% get something, and those who are getting anything up to 7 bags a hectare, or 7 bags each. 7 bags each, okay? 350 kgs a hectare. So those who are bigger are also getting far more than those who are smaller, okay? So it's very targeted towards the large-scale farmers in Zambia. If you compare with Malawi in the same season, let me get my head around how this is done. So as you go back, you are looking at what proportion got no voucher, 1 voucher, 2 vouchers, and then you're looking at that as you go along this way, according to how much the very poor, moderately poor, better off got. And what you see is that there's almost nobody who got more than 2 bags, or vouchers for 2 bags, so almost nobody's getting more than 100 kgs a hectare. Many people are getting 1 bag. So amongst those who get, it's a fairly even distribution as to what they get. It doesn't really matter how wealthy you are, how much you're getting. There's almost no correlation with wealth and what you get. So it's not particularly pro-poor, it's just incredibly broad-based. Everybody's getting it. 85% of people would get something in that year, but nobody got very much. Okay, so it's an incredibly broad-based program, unlike any other similar program. As I've tried to explain, the primary motivation for making it so broad-based was that desire to reach out to as many voters as possible by a president who had no real party machinery, no MPs to back him. He needed legitimacy and he needed some basis for his campaign in 2009. Now, let's tell a few more details of the story. One of the things which didn't come out for a while, it was flagged up, but people didn't take sufficient notice of it, was that fertiliser vouchers were distributed in 2 rounds. So most of the attention was on the first round, which is in the green, and this is showing how many millions of vouchers were distributed, okay? And most of them were distributed in this first round. The first round of vouchers was a very transparent process. And there were village-level meetings where villagers got together. There was agreement about who met the slightly vague criteria for that year, okay? And their names went forward to receive vouchers. When it was time for the vouchers to be distributed, the people came back again and the vouchers were distributed so that people could see who was getting it. Extension staff supported this. There were reports of some problems in some areas, as you would expect, but fundamentally very transparent. It's all recorded. You could go to the district offices and you could get all the names of who had received the first round of voucher allocation. Okay? So this is, in many ways, this is a great story, and it goes with the political imperative to show you're doing a broad-based thing. What people then paid less attention to, they picked up that something wasn't quite right, but there was this second round of voucher allocations, which got a bit bigger over time, where there was none of that transparency or accountability. And in fact, if you wanted to ask who got them, there was no information on this. Okay? By district, you could get a distribution by district, but you couldn't get anything else. What happened after the vouchers went to district level? Nothing was recorded. People then did work in villages, did surveys to ask what was going on. These were distributed to MPs, by MPs, to chiefs and by chiefs, and it was very much a political allocation process. It was then getting on board sort of influential people in key areas whose support the president needed in his bid to retain power. And what you can tell from the district allocation figures is that the north of the country got disproportionately far more of the second round of vouchers than anybody else. And the story about the north is that the two main parties, one had their stronghold in the south, one had their stronghold in the centre. The party in the north, which had historically been there, was discredited in the 2004-2005 elections because inexplicably they had backed the campaign from the previous president to change the constitution to 3 terms. He wasn't even from their party, but they'd backed him. And the people of the north said, you know, what were you doing? Backing the campaign for the president to change the constitution for 3rd term. And in the 2005 elections, they were roundly defeated. And so then there was a sort of vacuum where the President Mutharika saw that if I can get the support of the influential people in the north, that's going to tip the balance in my favour in the next election. Because traditionally, as I say, one party's from the north, one's from the south, one's from the centre. Whoever gets the support of the north wins. And so these vouchers were distributed disproportionately to the north. A couple of other things that were noteworthy about this. Steve talked about the logistical exercise and how impressive this was, and I've tried to say a little bit about the importance of having the capacity to do what you want to do. There had been some smaller scale subsidy programs in the 90s. Nothing on this scale, but there was a logistics unit in the Ministry of Agriculture which had experience for dealing with those, and that was used and sort of revitalised for the purposes of this subsidy. But the really interesting thing is President Mutharika did not appoint a Minister of Agriculture in his first term. He was the Minister of Agriculture, and he was the Minister of Agriculture to make sure that this happened exactly as he said. Okay, this was his sort of keynote policy that he wanted to see as being implemented. And the final thing to say is, because it's a voucher program, potentially this has great benefits for supporting the establishment of all sorts of stockists and distributors around the country. If they can be part of the voucher system, you go and you hand in your voucher there and get the fertiliser, and it can really increase the volumes of business of all sorts of rural distributors. And people argued that this is what the government should do. The donors argued it, and I think AGRA had been piloting work with distributors prior to this, but actually this program was all distributed through 2 state-run agencies against all advice, and it imposed quite high costs on farmers to actually get the fertiliser in the first place, because they had to go to the more or less centralised distribution points of one of these 2 agencies. But fundamentally it was so that everybody knew this is the government who's given you this fertiliser. Okay? And it was really damaging to private sector distribution networks and the development of independent input supply systems, and it was a real opportunity missed. But again, it seems that it's the political imperative that drove that aspect of the implementation of it.
Okay, well, one final slide just to summarise some of this experience. A lot of work was done to evaluate this, particularly by our close colleagues Ephraim Chirwa in Malawi and Andrew Dorwood in London. They found it not particularly easy to evaluate it, but when they did a benefit-cost ratio, their best estimate of what they could see was there was a 35% net benefit. So for every kwacha that had gone in, there was 1.35 kwacha of benefit. So overall, they said, this probably looks good. That is cost to benefit, not benefit to cost. Sorry. Yes, it is. Yes, it is. It is one of cost to 1.35 of benefit. Sorry if that is. It's an error, right? Okay. Now on the debit side, a lot of questions asked about the opportunity cost. The administrative tour de force was there, but a lot of investigations have said, well, the entire extension service, the entire field staff of the Ministry of Agriculture spends almost all of its time on the fertilizer distribution program and very little of its time on additional farm management advice or anything else other than the maize and beans fertilizer and seed thing. And people then say, well, you know, what would have happened if we'd used the money perhaps with more to research and extension and so on? So people have claimed there may be a higher opportunity cost to this than appears there. And then some people have said those wonderful numbers on the chart where you get the big increase in the harvests. Is this really true? And the reason that people say the data may be suspect is that with a harvest of over 3.5 million tons in Malawi, what you'd expect would be the prices would start to crash on the local market, yeah? One of the problems of Malawi is that if you do have a very good harvest, it's rather difficult to move the grain out of Malawi, and in any case, government is very reluctant to allow grain to leave Malawi, and the tendency is the price to come down. And in some of these years of apparently bumper harvests, the maize price hasn't come down, which has led people to say, have people massage the statistics to make the policy look good? And we simply have no way of knowing what the truth of that is. And the very last comment I'd make here is, what are we seeing in the Malawi case? When you have something as spectacular as this, the word goes round very quickly. And if somebody wanted to do an interesting piece of social science, you'd have quite a lot of fun going round senior policymakers in Africa saying, have you heard what the Malawi experience is and what did you hear? Yes? Because there are a couple of things that are not necessarily obvious from the Malawi experience. The first one is the degree to which it was limited and targeted and genuinely respected in that. The Zambian case shows exactly what can happen if you have a fertilizer subsidy that's not carefully targeted and doesn't have a limited element in it. And not everybody has appreciated that that is a very important feature of what was done in Malawi, to Malawi's very great credit. And the other point that is made, and this is again Chirwa and Dorwood, they've said, look, Malawi is a very, very special case in Africa. It's a landlocked country with very high costs of bringing food in. It's much cheaper to grow it domestically. People are enormously dependent on the maize harvest for basic living, for basic nutrition. Malawi is one of the poorest countries that you will see in Africa. It's unusually poor. The idea of a poverty trap, if it was going to apply anywhere in Africa, you would have expected to see it in rural Malawi. And they've gone further than this. They've said there are probably multiplier benefits in Malawi, that if you can increase maize production, you will put downward pressure on prices. We don't know whether we've got the production that did that. And if you can do that, you do an enormous power of good to a country which is got large levels of food insecurity where the food budget is very high. That, of course, is a story from the Asian Green Revolution, the benefits of downward pressure on food prices. But these effects are particularly strong in the case of Malawi. So if ever there was a case for a big public push like this, Malawi is the case. It doesn't necessarily come out in the same way when a country like Ghana says, oh, Malawi did it, so why don't we have a fertilizer subsidy? The same case would not necessarily apply in the case of Ghana. So there you have it. There's an introduction to the Malawi farm subsidy schemes.